All right. So this is topic 2.2, unemployment. It is our second macroeconomic statistic, and it corresponds to chapter 21 in your textbooks. So just a little bit of a recap from the previous topic, 2.1 GDP, or gross domestic product. This is the measure of all of the stuff that an economy produces in a given time period. So how productive we're being, how we're using our resources, how we're dealing with scarcity here. We talked about all the different ways that we calculate GDP using the expenditure approach, adjusting from nominal values to real values. And we also spoke a little bit about something called the business cycle. So the business cycle is kind of the natural ebb and flow of an economy as it expands and contracts, and how we get recessions or economic downturns and also economic growth periods. So that idea is definitely going to come through today because unemployment also fluctuates with that business cycle. So the key questions for this topic are: how are unemployment statistics calculated? What are some of the shortcomings of unemployment data? What are the major reasons for unemployment, and what can it tell us about the economy? So really similar to a lot of the key questions that we saw in GDP. How do we calculate it? What's great about this statistic? What makes it useful? And what are its problems? So that's going to be kind of a common theme in this topic. All right, so first things first about unemployment. Unemployment is one of those statistics that you hear frequently in the news. Most recently, with the coronavirus outbreak, unemployment rates are at about 14.7%, which is the highest we've had in a very long time. It's higher than the peak of the Great Recession back in 2008, 2009. During that time, unemployment rates reached about 10 or 11%. So currently we're facing higher levels of unemployment due to a lot of the pandemic response that has gone on. So what exactly does that 14.7% mean? What it measures is the percentage of people in the labor force who are unemployed. So there's this common misconception that people in the economy fall into one of two categories. You're either employed or you're unemployed, when really there are three categories. So the labor force consists of the employed and the unemployed people. So if you're employed, basically if you're working a job, you've worked an hour in the past month, you've earned 20 bucks or so in the past week, very, very small amounts of work still count as employed, whether it's full-time or part-time, whether you have your hours cut, your pay cut, whether you're doing more or less work than you'd like to. If you have a job, earning income for yourself, for an employer, running your own business, whatever it is, you count as employed. To count as unemployed, it's a little bit more than just not having a job. To be counted as unemployed, you have to be actively seeking work. So actively seeking work means you've made some sort of effort in the past 4 weeks. So you put in a job application, you went to a career fair, you dropped off your resume with an employer, but you have done something in the past 4 weeks to try to find a job, and that's what it means to be unemployed. So what that means is there's actually this third category out in the economy called folks who are not in the labor force. Those are people who don't have a job, and they're not trying to have a job. And the reason we don't count them as unemployed is because, well, they're not trying to work, right? So think like a retiree or someone who's going to college full-time, all of that stuff. So really there are three categories. There is employed, unemployed, which means you're actively seeking work, and then there is not in the labor force. So if we were to calculate the labor force, it includes both the employed people and the unemployed people, basically the folks in this description right here. And the unemployment rate measures the amount of the unemployed folks who are in that labor force. So it's just a ratio here. And we abbreviate the unemployment rate as lowercase u. So u equals, this is like saying the unemployment rate equals, and it's just a ratio of those unemployed folks over the entire labor force. And then we multiply it by 100 to make it a percentage. So that's a really important misconception. There's all those folks who are not in the labor force who are not in any way factored into this unemployment rate. People think the unemployment rate is a makeup of the entire population, and there's not. There's this whole big category not in the labor force who don't count. All right, so now we're going to talk about who exactly does not count as part of the labor force and therefore is not part of those unemployment statistics. First of all is jobless people who are not actively seeking work. So you haven't done anything in the past 4 weeks. It could be for any number of reasons. Maybe you're staying home and raising kids, like this guy in the photo. Maybe you are retired. Maybe you are enrolled in school full-time, college, things like that. And then it also doesn't include people who we say are not eligible to work. So if you're not work eligible, you're institutionalized, so that would mean you're in prison. Even though a lot of people do work in prison, it's a small fraction, so we're just not going to count them as part of that statistic. If you are active duty military, you are not considered work eligible by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That throws some people off, but the reason for that is if we were to go to war and deploy a bunch of people, our population statistics in terms of unemployment would warp a lot, and it would look like something funky was happening with the economy, when in reality just a bunch of people might have been moved abroad, been deployed. So to minimize that kind of confusion, we just do not count active duty military folks as part of our labor force or as work eligible. And then we also don't consider children under the age of 16 because most places have laws that restrict children younger than 16 from having jobs. So all of these folks do not count as part of my labor force, and therefore do not count as part of that unemployment rate. So we're going to do a little example here from September 2018. So I've got my general population isn't even on this table. What I do have here is my work eligible population. Also, this little dash here, some students get confused. They think it's a subtraction sign. It's not. It's just a hyphen. So this is just, it's not one word, but it's a hyphenated word. So work eligible. There's no subtraction going on here. But people see the numbers and think this means subtraction, but it's not. This is just a label. The work eligible population in September 2018 was a little over 206 million people. Of that work eligible population, many of them were not in the labor force, so my full-time students, my stay-at-home parents, my retirees, other people who just aren't looking. And then in the labor force, I've got 151 million roughly, and then that is split into the employed folks and the unemployed folks. So we can calculate our unemployment rate using this information. So where is my pen? There we go. All right. So the unemployment rate, lowercase u, is the number of unemployed people. So here it's about 5,964,000 divided by the labor force, which is 151,693. Oops, should probably erase that. That was ugly. 93,705, and then all of that times 100 to make it a percentage. So if you have a calculator handy, I'm going to grab mine real quick. 5964. I got 3.93% as my unemployment rate. So 3.93%. So what this means is about 3.93 or roughly 4% of my labor force was unemployed back in 2018. So a big difference between our current unemployment rate during this pandemic and what we see is more typical, something in this range for our economy in the United States when the economy is not struggling. So really interesting stuff. All right, so now we're going to talk about some shortcomings with the unemployment rate. Most people would agree that there's two primary shortcomings of the unemployment rate, which is that percentage that we calculate, whether it's 3.9% or 14.7%, does not account for these two groups of workers shown in orange. So the first group is a discouraged worker. So a discouraged worker is someone who you or I would consider unemployed. These are people who want to work, but they've given up looking because economic conditions just are too rough for them, the labor market conditions. It's tough out there. It's a lot of work to go on interviews and fill out applications and work on your resume. If you've ever tried looking for a job, it is very, very exhausting And it's all about putting yourself out there and taking a lot of rejections before you find the right fit, and a lot of effort has to go into that. So when people give up and they haven't made an effort in the past 4 weeks, they are discouraged. They're not considered part of our labor force because they've stopped actively looking, but they're also not considered unemployed anymore. So discouraged workers is a big mistake here, or at least what most people would say a big shortcoming of the unemployment rate. And I have this picture of Donald Trump down in the bottom right. So this is part of the election debate for the last election cycle, back for the 2016 presidency. And if you give that a click, or if you go to supplemental video tutorials, really would be better for topic 2.2, there is one called The Lesson Video on Trump and Discouraged Workers. So if you want to hit pause here, jump over to supplemental video tutorials and then come back. I'll discuss that. Alright, so if you watch that video, Donald Trump, whether you are a fan of Donald Trump or not, there's something to like or not like about that very quick little clip from the debates. He mentions this shortcoming of the unemployment rate, the discouraged workers. He talks about how when people give up and they go home, they give up, they're no longer counted as unemployed. And he's correct about that. That's a problem with our unemployment rate, and it makes unemployment look lower than most of us would really consider it to be. What he gets wrong in this clip, so if you're not a fan of Trump, here's a little tip for you, is he kind of makes that first mistake we talked about. He recognizes that discouraged workers aren't counted statistically as unemployed, but he automatically defaults them into the employed category. He says they statistically count as employed. That's not true. He is actually forgetting about this last category that the population can fit into, which is not in the labor force, and that's where discouraged workers fall. So it is confusing how unemployment statistics are considered. Discouraged workers, they don't count as part of our unemployment rate. They don't count as employed either. They're kind of just not considered in those statistics altogether. The second group of workers that are neglected in our unemployment rate are underemployed workers. So to be underemployed means one of two things applies to you. First, that you are employed at a job that is below your skill set. So this is like if an industry is struggling and your employer has to let you go and you are working a fairly high-skilled job, say maybe at a bank or as a college professor or something like that, and you find something temporary to kind of pay the bills. So if I were to lose this job as a professor at Valencia College and I took up a bartending job while I looked for more college-level teaching jobs in the meantime, I still count as employed, right? Whether I am teaching college classes or I'm waiting tables, whatever it is. So if you are in a job that is below your skill level, you are still considered employed. And then additionally, you can be underemployed if you would like to be full-time, but you don't have the full-time option. Your employer, for whatever reason, says, sorry, I can't give you any more hours. I can give you these part-time hours. It doesn't matter as far as the Bureau of Labor Statistics is concerned whether you're working full-time or part-time. If you've done any sort of work within a recent time frame for a recent decent amount of money, they're going to consider you employed. So this is really problematic, especially during recessions, because there's a lot of discouraged workers. There are a lot of underemployed workers, and so that unemployment rate doesn't capture them. It doesn't tell us who those folks are. They're not considered a part of that percentage. I've got another video clip here that kind of reiterates some of the discouraged and underemployed workers. So hit pause here, jump back over to supplemental video tutorials, and click on the lesson video about Adam Ruin's the unemployment rate. And it's a clip from a TV show where he kind of gives some examples of underemployed and discouraged workers. Alright, so if you watched that video, hopefully you could identify who from the game show was discouraged versus who was underemployed. So in the clip, Trista, who said she was so depressed she hadn't been looking for work, she's one of those discouraged workers. She is not considered part of our labor force. The other two guys in the video, the one who mowed his neighbor's lawn and the one who's driving Uber, they're going to count as employed, right? Because they are part of that underemployed category. So we can really see some examples of why the unemployment rate is flawed. So I've got some statistics here. This shows some Bureau of Labor Statistics data that has the official unemployment rate here in green, and then the orange line above it is the unemployment rate plus all marginally attached workers plus total employed part-time for economic reasons. So this orange line here helps us capture some of those underemployed workers. And you can see the orange line is much, much higher than the green line, and that the space between them gets bigger during this recession. So this is the 2008 recession. You can see the gap between the reported unemployment rate and the one with some of those underemployed workers is much wider, whereas if the economy is healthy, this difference between them is smaller. So a lot of those discrepancies expand during recessions. All right, so some other shortcomings of the unemployment rate is the feedback timeline. So the unemployment rate is something that we call a lagging indicator, which means it tells us information about the economy after it's already happened. Typically, we don't see the unemployment rate jump up until we are well into a recession or even coming out of a recession. So I'm going to just move back for a second. You can see the shaded in region represents the recession in 2008 and 2009, and you can see the unemployment rate reached its higher levels towards the end or even right after. And that's what I mean by a lagging indicator, is by the time we look at unemployment statistics to figure out if we're in a recession, we've probably already been in one for a while. Additionally, when we start to come out of recessions, we can actually see spikes in unemployment, which can be misleading. So if we've been in a recession for a long time, the economy has been in bad shape for a while, what happens is a lot of those discouraged workers who have been kind of chilling at home, giving up, looking for work, they hear the economy is beginning to recover and they begin actively looking for work again. So then they go from not counting as part of the labor force to now inflating that unemployment rate. Because they have some hope about the economy and have decided to start looking again, we can actually see that percentage jump up, which looks like a bad thing, but in reality is a good thing because they've started looking again. So be aware that the unemployment rate can actually increase when the economy is getting better. And then lastly is the unemployment rate doesn't tell us anything about the nature of unemployment. It doesn't tell us what kind of worker. We might be more concerned about certain industries over others. It doesn't tell us how long someone's been unemployed. Reasonably, we'd be more worried about someone who's had a long-term struggle trying to find work than someone who's just maybe between jobs or switching firms or moving to a new city, something like that. But the unemployment rate does not make any distinction between those workers. All right, so we're going to do another little practice here. So we are going to calculate the unemployment rate based on the information in this table. And then we're going to change some of our unemployment statistics, see what happens if some of our unemployed workers become discouraged, and then compare that to the new rate. So I am going to move down here where I've got my table. So this is the same table from the slides. And question 1 asked to calculate the unemployment rate. So we are going to calculate our unemployment rate. So remember, that's the number of unemployed people over my labor force and times 100. So first, we have to figure out who is unemployed here. So in the table, I've got the total population, I've got my full-time workers, I've got my part-time workers, I have those looking for work, folks under 16, the armed forces, non-civilian, that's the same as active duty, and retirees. So the only people who count as unemployed are going to be the people who are looking for work. So that's 14 million people. We're going to put 14. I'll just leave the million off here in the top portion. And now I need my labor force. So the labor force includes employed and unemployed people added together. So I already know my unemployed people. That's going to be 14 million. Now we have to figure out who in this table counts as employed. So think about it for a second. Hit pause if you want to try it on your own. All right. So the people who count as employed are going to be both my full-time workers and my part-time workers. So we're going to add all of those together. So my 14 million unemployed plus my 103 full-time workers plus my 27 part-time workers. When we add all of this together, that should be 144, I believe. Double checking my math. Yeah, that looks right. And then times 100. So if you have a calculator handy, just type that in. I got an unemployment rate of 9.72%. So that's the answer to our first question here, which is calculate the current unemployment rate, rounded to 2 decimal points. All right, the second question says, what happens if this statistic changes a bit? If 4 million workers who are currently unemployed become discouraged, what is our new unemployment rate? So moving back over here, I'm saying what happens if 4 million workers who are currently unemployed now become discouraged? So what that means is of this 14 million people, 4 million of them are just going to stop looking for work. So there's only 10 million left who are still looking for work. Now we have to calculate the new unemployment rate. So my new unemployment rate is going to be 10 million up top. And here's the mistake people make. Those 4 million who no longer count as unemployed, those also no longer count as part of the labor force. So instead of putting 144 here at the bottom, we're just going to put 140, because my new labor force here is going to be 10 million plus the 103 plus the 27, because those unemployed folks are also part of the labor force. So both of these numbers decrease by 4 million. Then times 100. And let's see, I need a calculator for that. I got 7.14%. So that's my new unemployment rate. That's question 2. Question 3 says, how does this new unemployment rate compare to the first one we calculated? So if we compare these two, it's pretty clear that the unemployment rate fell by more than 2%. And so the reason I want you to compare the two is because imagine if these were real statistics, these weren't made up numbers, and you hear on the news that the unemployment rate is falling. Most people would assume that's good news. But here, this is not necessarily good news. In fact, it's probably bad news that 4 million people simply gave up looking for work. So we have to be very wary of our unemployment statistics that we hear in the news. All right, so there's some other labor market statistics that I want you to know. One is the labor force participation rate. So the labor force participation rate is the portion of the work-eligible population, again, not a subtraction sign, just a hyphen, that is in the labor force. So that means there are folks who are in the labor force, so this is all my employed and unemployed people, but then there's people who fit into this category, work-eligible. So this is all of my non-institutionalized, above 16 years old, non-military folks. So this work-eligible population would include retirees and discouraged workers and things like that. They would count as work-eligible even though they don't necessarily count as part of the labor force. And so when we put this rate next to the unemployment rate, we can kind of mitigate some of those issues where the unemployment rate understates true unemployment. And what it tells us is the fraction of people who are trying to participate in that labor force. They are working or they are looking for work. You can also split it up by different demographic variables, gender, age, things like that, to see how our population changes over time, and it can be really interesting stuff. So this is the same data set from September of 2018 that we worked with before to calculate the unemployment rate, except now I want to calculate the labor force participation rate using this little equation here. So I am going to move back up here to this table. So this is the same data. Instead of calculating unemployment, we are going to calculate the labor force participation rate. So I'm just going to abbreviate that. Labor force participation rate. So the way we get that is we are going to put our labor force up top. There's our labor force right there. So 151,693,705 people. And then we're going to divide it by the work-eligible population. So our work-eligible population is this top number in this little tree here. So we are going to put 206,559,270 folks as my work-eligible population. And then we're going to multiply it by 100 to calculate that. So that one I got 73.44%. That's my labor force participation rate. That is who is trying to participate in my labor force, has a job or is looking for one. So I have this cool graph of labor force participation over time for the past couple decades or so. You can see that starting in 2008, there was a significant decline. Part of that was due to the recession. Labor force participation was down as people got discouraged, but you can see it kind of came back up. It had a little bit of a jump in response as we recovered from that recession. But then it's been on a much steadier decline since then and kind of stayed consistently low. One of the reasons for that is because there is a large subset of the United States work-eligible population called the baby boomer generation. Those are folks who were born right after World War II. They might be your parents or grandparents at this point. You guys keep getting younger as I keep teaching economics. And those folks are entering retirement age. And so as they enter retirement, they leave the labor force, but they're still work eligible. And so our labor force participation is declining. And it has a lot of implications for a lot of government programs that are geared towards retired folks, like Social Security and healthcare programs as well. So interesting stuff. Here's labor force participation split up by gender. So we've got the men's labor force participation rate in blue and the ladies in red. So you can see over a much longer time horizon that female labor force participation has increased as more women have entered the workforce and different movements for equality and equal pay for equal work and all that interesting stuff. And you can kind of see this steady decline in men's participation. It's so funny, whenever I show this in classes, some students think it's because the women are taking all the jobs, but in reality it's much more cultural. So there's a lot more stay-at-home dads nowadays than there used to be, and fewer stay-at-home moms. They kind of traded off just a little bit that way. But more importantly, the small decline that we see here in men's labor force participation has to do with a lot of men delaying entering the workforce by getting a college education first. It wasn't quite as common to get a college education back in the 1950s. Now it's more standard, and so as more men are delaying entering that workforce and instead opting for full-time college education, that's caused a little bit of a temporary decline. Not necessarily a bad thing overall for our labor force in terms of the quality of workers that the U.S. economy is seeing. All right, so now we're going to talk about the different types of unemployment and what that can tell us about an economy. So first things first is that 0% unemployment is actually not what we shoot for most of the time. It's just not really practical, and we say it's not really desirable to have 0% unemployment in the economy. Part of an economy that is changing and evolving means that there's kind of this churn of jobs as they evolve over time. So there are three types of unemployment, and two of them we consider not necessarily bad types of unemployment. In some cases, it can even be good for an economy. Of course, we don't want unemployment getting out of hand. The levels that it's at right now of almost 15% are too much, but just because we don't want too much unemployment doesn't mean we want to get rid of all of it altogether, or even that we could. Some unemployment is always going to exist in the economy. So understanding which type of these unemployments and getting at the root causes of those unemployment helps us determine whether or not we should be worried about unemployment or not. So this is the unemployment rate for the United States. You can see here, looking at that vertical axis, that we really don't dip below 2% ever, so that's why 0% is just really not practical for us. But we certainly don't want it getting very high either. So looking at 2010, when unemployment reached over 10%, that's problematic as well. So this is kind of cool. You can see those business cycles happening. Looking at the unemployment rate, we're used to looking at business cycles by looking at our GDP over time. But this also reflects those same business cycles. However, the peaks and the valleys are flipped. So these peaks in the unemployment rate, this is high unemployment, so that represents a contraction or a recession in the business cycle, whereas high GDP represented an expansion. Here, because unemployment rises during those economic downturns, those are my contractions. And where we have low unemployment, lots of people are working, the economy's doing well, we see low rates of unemployment, these troughs, those are my economic expansions. So kind of cool. It's like the flip of the business cycle graph, looking at output over time. All right, so the first type of unemployment is structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is not necessarily a bad thing for the economy. In fact, some structural unemployment is a good thing. It is a sign of growth. It's a sign of this process here that I have written called creative destruction. So first things first, if you are structurally unemployed, that means a worker is out of a job because their skills no longer fit within the economy. So think the structure of the economy has shifted in some way, and that job simply does not exist anymore. And so a lot of this structural unemployment happens as new technologies come about, as comparative advantages shift between different countries of the world, and certain jobs are outsourced to other countries. And we don't necessarily need to shy away from it. So the example I always think of with structural unemployment is the idea of a milkman. So back in the day, before refrigeration, there was this guy who had a job delivering milk every day to households because it didn't keep for that long because we didn't have refrigerators. And then with the invention of refrigeration, suddenly the milkman was out of a job, right? So when the milkman lost his job to refrigeration, that's an example of structural unemployment. Not great news for the milkman. However, ultimately, I don't think anybody would argue that refrigeration was a bad thing for the economy, even though it did create some unemployment for the milkman. So structural unemployment, as we come up with new technologies, as industries mutate and revolutionize, there's kind of some natural job turnover. There's some unemployment that's creative. So more recent examples would be thinking about Airbnb, maybe creating some unemployment in the hotel industry, or Uber is creating some unemployment in the taxi cab industry. And these are satisfying a lot of consumer wants and needs and making our economy more efficient. But the result is people are facing structural unemployment. But this generally is not a concern for our economy. It's usually a sign of growth and development. So we don't worry too much about that. Some structural unemployment is a good thing. So here I've just got some three main categories of how structural unemployment has occurred in the United States. There's kind of been three major shifts in how the U.S. economy has evolved. We started off as an agricultural-based economy, lots of farming, lots of hard labor out under the sun, working fields, things like that. And then we shifted a little bit towards a factory and manufacturing-based economy in the United States. Workers got out of the hot sun. Labor conditions improved a little bit, but certainly were not glamorous in those factories. And nowadays we work in mostly service-based industries. The U.S. has a very service-based economy. People get to work in air conditioning, wearing business casual clothes in front of a computer. And that is a result of structural unemployment. And each of those shifts have resulted in the loss or the outsourcing of those previous jobs. And that does not mean that we need to worry about those jobs moving abroad. right? As our economy evolves, as our labor force becomes more skilled, labor markets can improve, labor market conditions improve, working conditions improve, and a lot of those jobs move as our structure of the economy shifts. Okay, so here's a graph of the same information that I was just describing, those three kind of major shifts in the US economy. So this kind of navy purpley line that's downward sloping over the past couple hundred years represents agriculture, which has declined as a percentage of our labor force that works in that industry has declined. In contrast, we've seen the percentage of the labor force working in service-based industries, that bright blue line, increase over time. And industry that's more of that manufactured-based stuff, we can see that there's an increase until about the 1960s, and then that steadily declined over time as well as we've shifted to a more specialized service-based economy here in the United States. So pretty interesting stuff. So if you want to hit pause here, this is a great example of structural unemployment. It's also a little bit comedic. Shows kind of why structural unemployment is not necessarily a bad thing for the economy as a whole, though it can make structurally unemployed workers uncomfortable. So pay special attention here to the arguments that my potentially structurally unemployed worker here is making, and then we'll discuss it. Alright, so hopefully you hit pause, we're able to check out the supplemental video tutorials, the lesson video about structural unemployment for a couple of cavemen. If you listen to a lot of the arguments that those cavemen make in the video, it's really similar to what you hear from a lot of US workers as the structure of our economy evolves, right? Where did all those good factory jobs go? That's where my dad or mother or whoever worked and was able to support their family, and they really yearn for those past jobs. However, we do not want to save the obsolete jobs or save the inefficient jobs that would be better done abroad in a country with the comparative advantage in that. So there is an argument to be made that we can do a lot more to help structurally unemployed people, help them retrain, re-educate, or relocate. So those could be funded by private organizations or by government programs as well. And then there's always the option for structurally unemployed workers to change their expectations about the availability of work and what they're paid for that work. But typically, most of the response to structural unemployment in order to keep the economy chugging along is to help those structurally unemployed workers find that new, highly skilled skill set that fits into the new structure of an evolving and developing economy. The second type of unemployment is frictional unemployment. So if you remember from physics class, learning about friction, friction does a few things. It heats things up, but it also slows things down. And so frictional unemployment is just kind of the natural job search process that can be slow and time-consuming. So frictional unemployment is not necessarily a bad thing for the economy because by definition it's temporary. It occurs as workers move from job to job. So feasibly, one day you will graduate, that is the dream, and hopefully you will get many job offers coming your way once you get your degree. And you might not want to accept the first job offer that comes your way. You might want to go on several interviews, you might want to visit with different companies in your field, you might want to negotiate your pay upwards, something like that. And as you are making those decisions and exploring those job options, you count as unemployed, you don't have a job, but you're actively looking, but it's not necessarily a bad thing for the economy, you're just taking your time. And then from the employer side, we also want that same process. Firms don't always want to hire the first person who applies for an open position they have. They want to take their time and make sure that they invest in the right fit for their company. So frictional unemployment to some degree is a good thing. We don't want to eliminate it. We don't want people jumping into the first job they see or hiring the first applicant who applies. So some of this existing in the economy is a good thing. Now, if we can match people to the right job faster and reduce the amount of frictional unemployment, that would also be good. It would just be more efficient. So a lot of job search websites like LinkedIn, I have that little icon here. It's kind of like a social network for professionals. So you can post your resume, post a professional headshot, and create professional connections for people and endorse different skill sets, and employers can find you on websites like that. and other, just generally the internet and the use of different recruiters and recruiter sites has helped us reduce a lot of the frictional unemployment that occurs in the economy. So an interesting thing about frictional unemployment, we said it's not necessarily bad for the economy, and that is true. But one thing about frictional unemployment is highly influenced by government policies. So there's two particular government policies that I want to talk about. The main one being unemployment insurance. So unemployment insurance, sometimes it's just called unemployment, is a government benefits program for people who are laid off from work. You've probably heard it a lot in the news when people get their unemployment. Part of the CARES Act that was passed in response to coronavirus increased the amount of unemployment benefits that people receive. And there are serious upsides to having programs like this. First is that it provides income to workers who are laid off or fired from their job. As long as they're not fired for particular reasons, there's different ways to apply and to qualify for unemployment. So workers who have to be let go, they are given income, they are able to feed their families, continue paying their bills, and then it also benefits the economy as a whole. First of all, it gives people the right time to find a job. They don't have to jump into the first job they see. We might want someone with a highly skilled technical skill set to take their time rather than immediately start working at a fast food restaurant or working a retail job because they just need some sort of income to pay the bills. It might be more efficient for the economy in the long run if they actually take those benefits and take their time and find a job that matches that highly skilled skill set. Second, it can prevent economic problems from spreading. So if there are issues that are concentrated in one particular industry, it can stop it from spreading to other industries if there's some support. Overall, it can reduce kind of the ripple effect throughout the economy. The downside of unemployment insurance is that it reduces incentives to find another job quickly. So this is sometimes referred to as the Samaritan's Dilemma. It's the idea that sometimes providing people with help and support can limit them or discourage them, disincentivize them from helping themselves. We've seen this a lot with the CARES Act, actually, that some workers are actually hoping that they get fired because the government's increased unemployment benefits means they would actually be making more if they got unemployment than working their regular job. So you can see how that would be bad for reducing unemployment in the economy. And it creates incentives to not work or to not work for very long, that if unemployment insurance benefits become too generous, there's no sense for the economy as a whole to get back to work, right? People will just kind of sit back and collect their very, very generous benefits for as long as they can if they become too high. Now, what that level is, what's the trade-off here between supporting workers and supporting workers too much so that we discourage employment, that's for all the politicians to debate about. But we recognize that this trade-off exists in economics. All right, the other policy that can affect frictional unemployment are hiring and firing regulations. So hiring regulations that maybe promote diversity, or firing regulations that require employers provide certain benefits if they need to let someone go, that is going to also increase the amount of frictional unemployment in the economy. And the reason is because it makes businesses very hesitant to hire new workers. So unemployment insurance increased frictional unemployment because more workers would take their time finding a job when they're getting those unemployment benefits. Here, it's from the firm side. If they have to comply with these hiring and firing regulations, it's going to make it harder for young workers to get a foothold here when the employer knows that if they fire them, they're going to have to pay them these generous benefits. And then the upside, though, to hiring and firing regulations is it increases job stability in the U.S. So there are ups and downs for each of these policies, and just weighing how it affects frictional unemployment is worth considering. All right, so here to kind of show you the impact that policy can have on the frictional unemployment and therefore the overall rate of unemployment in two different countries. I have two countries' unemployment rates over time, the United States in blue and then Spain here in orange. So you can see that Spain's unemployment rate is much, much higher than the United States. And one of the reasons is because they have some of those really strict hiring and firing regulations. There is this one law on the books in Spain that if a firm wanted to fire an employee for some reason, they would have to continue to pay them their salary for 40 days for every year that they worked for that company. And the idea was to provide workers with more job stability here and more income stability if their employer wanted to let them go. The result was high levels of frictional unemployment, causing the overall rate of unemployment in Spain to reach over 20% in some cases. Whereas in the United States, we have a very low regulated labor market, and so our frictional unemployment and total unemployment is lower. So when you think about that law in Spain, 40 days for every year an employee has worked for the company. If a company needed to let a 10-year veteran employee go, they would have to continue to pay them for over a year, right? 400 days. So that obviously led to increased unemployment in Spain, whether that's worth it for the increased job stability versus something like 25% unemployment. Again, that's up to you to decide. 25% unemployment would mean about 1 in 4 people did not have a job who wanted one. So is that worth the fact that the other 3 out of 4 people have a very stable job situation? That's for you to decide. All right, the last type of unemployment is cyclical unemployment. It is called cyclical because it is tied to that business cycle, specifically the contraction in the business cycle, an economic downturn. When we're in a recession or a depression, we get cyclical unemployment. These are folks who are unemployed not because their job skills don't match the structure of the economy, not because it's just temporary, frictional unemployment and they'll get a job eventually. This is the only objectively bad type of unemployment because there's no real root cause that we can remedy. There's no real timeline on when it's going to end. It's just because the economy is struggling. So this is the bulk of what we see spike the total unemployment rate during a recession, is we see more cyclically unemployed workers. So back in 2008, cyclical unemployment total unemployment reached about 10%, and the bulk of that was because most workers were cyclically unemployed. So that's the bad type of unemployment. That's why we don't like unemployment getting too high, because it means some of this exists. Whether it's the 2008 recession, the Great Depression, like this photo here in the bottom right, or the new economic crisis happening in the midst of coronavirus. So now that we kind of understand our 3 different types of unemployment, we know that not all of them are necessarily bad. What is a healthy rate of unemployment for an economy? We know it's not 0%, and we know it's going to vary from country to country depending on their policy. So we're just going to define the healthy rate of unemployment as this abstract idea called the natural rate of unemployment. And we'll abbreviate it U star. So if we put a little star next to the lowercase u, that means this is the natural rate of unemployment. It consists only of the 2 good types of unemployment, structural and frictional. And then we compare it to actual unemployment that we see in the economy, which is what we calculate. And then we can determine what stage of the business cycle we're in. We can also relate the natural rate of unemployment to something called full employment output, or Y star. So if you remember from the last topic, the expenditure approach of GDP, we said Y equals, and then we had our 4 expenditure components added together. So Y star represents a healthy level of output in our economy when there is no cyclical unemployment. So Y star can also be called potential GDP or potential output. It's just my GDP variable when the economy is healthy, and U star is my unemployment variable that we can expect when the economy is healthy. So if you put a little star next to it, it means what we're shooting for. All right, so this can look a little bit confusing, these inequalities here, but really just think about these symbols in terms of their definitions. So U star, this is my natural rate of unemployment, and consists of my 2 good types, the structural unemployment plus the frictional unemployment. actual U, unemployment, consists of all three types added together. So really the only difference between these two equations, natural rate and actual rate of unemployment, is this guy, cyclical unemployment. So it all comes down to how much cyclical unemployment exists in an economy that determines which stage of the business cycle we're in. So the first stage we're going to talk about relating these variables is a contraction. So this is a decline in the business cycle. Sometimes it's called a recession or a depression if they're especially severe. And that means there is positive cyclical unemployment in the economy. I mean positive as in there's a positive value for it. There is cyclical unemployment going on, not positive like good, but positive as in a positive percentage of cyclical unemployment exists. So if I add in a positive number here to this equation, that means actual unemployment is going to be bigger because I'm adding in this positive number here than the natural rate. So we'll see unemployment being greater than the natural rate. That's going to correspond to output, actual GDP, Y, being lower, less than my potential GDP, Y star. So I want you to know those ideas. During a contraction or a recession, I get a positive value for cyclical unemployment, which means unemployment is above the healthy level and GDP is below the healthy level. It makes sense when you think about what those terms mean and what they represent. The second stage is when the economy is healthy. So this means we are kind of between an expansion or a contraction. We're kind of moving along that long-term growth trend for the economy. That means we have no cyclical unemployment going on. So if I were to add in a 0 here, you can kind of just take anything out, right? If you add 0 to anything, it's just what it originally was without the 0. These two equations become equal. And so actual unemployment is equal to the natural rate, and that means output is equal to our potential GDP, or our full employment output. So at a healthy level, we have no cyclical unemployment, and actual rates of unemployment and GDP are equal to both the natural rate and their potential GDP. The last kind of stage in comparison here is during an expansion. So an expansion is when the economy is growing rapidly, and it's really growing at a rate that is a bit unsustainable. It's above what we can maintain in the long term. So when that happens, we're going to have a negative number for cyclical unemployment. So if I were to add a negative number into this equation, it's going to mean actual unemployment is less than the natural rate. So I actually have an unemployment rate that is below what we can consider healthy. So we have a lot of jobs happening and unemployment is unusually low. And when that's happening, because a lot of people are working, we have very low unemployment, our GDP is above our long-term potential. So this might seem strange to you, the idea that we have negative unemployment and greater than our potential production. But what this really represents during an expansion is an economy that is just being overly productive. So think about a week when you have a lot of finals hitting for school. You might spend a lot of extra time studying, right? You might spend more than your typical time in the library, and that's not going to be sustainable across a whole semester. During an expansion, that's kind of what the U.S. economy is doing. They're being overproductive for a short time period, but eventually they're going to have to come back down to at least this healthy level that's sustainable. They're just being overproductive at this point. All right, so here kind of is that idea relating the natural rate to the actual rate of unemployment. So this red line is U, and this blue line is U star. So for the United States, the natural rate of unemployment is estimated to be somewhere between 3 and 5%. You can see it kind of fluctuates over time as the frictional and structural amount of unemployment in the economy fluctuates. And then actual unemployment can be above the natural rate or below the natural rate. And so it kind of fluctuates around that. So we're going to do one last set of problems based on this equation. So we are going to calculate the natural rate of unemployment, the actual rate of unemployment, and then use that unemployment information to tell us something about the economy. What stage of the business cycle are we in, and what is true about GDP. So I am going to move over here. to my last table. Perfect. So this is our frictional unemployment in the economy is 2%. I've got 1% structural unemployment and 1% cyclical unemployment. So question 1 here says, what is the natural rate of unemployment, U star? Sorry about that. So U star consists of the two quote-unquote good types of unemployment, which is the structural and the frictional. So that's going to be 1% plus 2%. So in our hypothetical economy here, the natural rate of unemployment, what we're shooting for is 3%. So that's question 1. Question 2 says, what is actual unemployment, U? So using that same equation from this slide here, or a different equation for U, we're going to add up all 3 types. So I've got actual unemployment is equal to structural, 1%, plus frictional, which is 2%, plus cyclical unemployment, 1%. So actual unemployment here is going to be 4%. That's the answer to question 2. All right, question 3 is really the one that matters, which is compare the two and figure out what stage of the business cycle we're in, right? Based on the rates calculated, the current economy is in what stage of the business cycle. So here I've got U is greater than U star because 4%, which is our actual unemployment rate, is greater than the natural rate of 3%. So if I have unemployment that is above the natural rate, now I can kind of use this information backwards here. I've got, clicking around all over the place. I've got actual unemployment 4%, greater than the natural rate of 3%. That means my economy is in an economic contraction. If that contraction is especially bad, we'll call it a recession. So answer to number 3 here, we've got a contraction in the business cycle. So remember, contraction is kind of the general term. Recession is a special name we give to severe contractions. Alternatively, you could look at this problem by seeing that there is a positive number here for cyclical unemployment. So heading back over here, we've got cyclical unemployment is positive. That means we're in a recession, this kind of red zone here. All right, and the last question, question 4, is what can you assume is happening to GDP, why, during this time? So now we know unemployment is above the natural rate. We are in a contraction in our business cycle. That is going to mean that GDP is probably falling, right? It's being less productive, and more specifically, real GDP Y is going to be less than our potential GDP, our Y star. So, and that's the answer to question 4. And all of that can be found in this top row here, just using these little inequalities we talked about. So that's all I've got for unemployment. Definitely try some of the practice questions and let me know if you have questions via email. Bye.